Welcome to the One Inside, an Internal Family Systems podcast. I'm your host, Tammy Sallenberger. Today, I chat with Daphne Fatter about inviting curiosity with racist parts. I am so excited to tell you about the Heirloom Summit, which is co-created by Duran Young, founder of Black Therapist Rock, and Dick Swartz, founder of IFS. It is intentionally taking place during Black History Month on February 26th through the 28th. We are going to be offering this collective healing experience as a powerful opportunity to explore the legacy burden of racism and anti-Blackness. Using IFS, we will explore the witnessing and unburdening process to work towards increased self-leadership and to begin repairing the personal impact of our traumatic history as a nation. Stay tuned for a link for the listeners of the One Inside podcast so you can receive a discount when you register. On today's episode, I chat with Dr. Daphne Fatter, certified IFS therapist and licensed psychologist in private practice in Dallas, Texas. They just got tons and tons of snow. She teaches workshop on white racial socialization for therapists, in addition to teaching on trauma treatment for TZK seminars. She is a trained facilitator by challenging racism to lead conversations on race and racism. This is the last episode in the Heirloom Summit Series, and I'm super excited because I think Daphne's perfect for this. We talk about kids and teaching kids about whiteness, privilege, and racism. We talk about trailheads to our own protective parts around racism. And we spent a lot of time going through this 6-stage white racial development model by Janet Helms. I finally have the link to the special discount for the One Inside podcast listeners. So that link for the Heirloom Summit to receive a discount as a listener, go to the show notes to click on that link and get your special discount. And I appreciate your patience. I went ahead and put it on the past several podcast episodes. And let's see, what else do I want to tell you? I'm excited about this episode. It's amazing to me how different, some similarities and some differences with all of the past 5 episodes in the Heirloom Summit series. And I'm just really appreciative of Duran Young for spearheading this. I would love to connect to you and with you, and I'd love to hear what you think about this series. So connect with me on Instagram at IFS Tammy and on Twitter and on the One Inside Facebook page. And I'm going to take next week off. I've been doing weekly podcasts. I think I took a break 1 week off at Christmas, and I might have taken a week off at Thanksgiving. I don't remember, but I'm definitely feeling like I need a week off. So next week there will be no podcast. And then the week after that, I actually have 5 in the books that I did in January. So I cannot wait to roll them out to you. We're going to start with, I haven't completely decided, but I'm pretty sure we're going to start with talking about self. I think after all this conversation on racism, I think I'd love to take a deep dive into learning about self. So I think that's going to be the first one up, and possibly a 3-part series on self. How's that sound? Hope you're doing well, you're staying warm wherever you are, and enjoy. What I would like you to do is just tell everybody where you are in the world and what you see if you look out your nearest window.
Okay, so I'm going to actually walk, because right now I'm at my kitchen table, which is my home office during the pandemic, which is not very exciting. So I'm actually going to walk to so I can see my backyard. So I am on traditional lands of Wichita, Caddo, Comanche, and Cherokee tribes. And as I look out my window, I see it's a very still day here. I see my hammock outside. I see lots of trees from my backyard. And I see bird feeders that my kids made. So a couple different bird feeders. Yeah, it's a gray, cold day here. And I'm in Dallas, Texas. So it is, it's cold for Dallas. It's like in the 40s. So it's like,
Oh, that is cold. Yeah. I was just going to say your definition of cold is probably going to be different than mine, but that is cold. I mean, that's
Yeah.
cold for here too.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's cold and gray, and it's a good day to stay kind of inside.
Yeah.
So
Do you watch football? Are you a
I
Super
do
Bowl fan?
not. Yes. No, I'm not a big football person. I'm into other sports, but not football. So
Not
yeah.
football.
Yeah. So I know today's Super Bowl Sunday.
Yes.
So
Yes.
yeah.
I'm excited. Yeah, my husband's a huge Dallas Cowboy fan,
Oh,
actually.
is he really?
Yeah. So we're from Maryland originally. So when we lived in Maryland, we actually drove when we were younger. I'm like, I would not want to well, actually, now I probably would because of the pandemic. I'm like, I'd love to drive across the country. But we drove from Maryland to Dallas and stayed in Dallas and like went to this like famous preacher's like church and then went to the Dallas Cowboy game and just did all kinds of fun stuff. So yeah, we've actually
That's
done that
awesome.
twice. And then we lived in New Orleans and then we ended up having like a friend of a friend lived somewhere in the Dallas area and we went and stayed and like watched the game. But it was all before the big new stadium. So this was
Mm-hmm.
years ago. But yeah, and you have a
Yeah.
hammock outside. I have a hammock too, but it goes away in the winter because I get lots of snow. So
Yeah. We had snow flurries earlier this year, which is like the first time in several years we've had snow, probably like 10 years. So
that's exciting.
yeah, it was very exciting. Yeah.
Yeah. So tell me so today we're going to talk about working with our white parts.
That's right.
And so I guess before we get into that, I'm curious about your story and why this is important to you and sort of how you came to um, have this topic be, important to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So my sort of journey to working with my whiteness and my white parts really is kind of an accumulation of things. In the 90s, when I was in college, sort of dates me, but study abroad was like the big new thing happening in a lot of, American colleges. And I decided to study abroad in South Africa. Which was in 96, and it was 2 years after apartheid fell. Nelson Mandela was, leading the country. And that was really the first time that I realized that I was white, as a white person, was living in South Africa. I lived there for 6 months and was really aware, like, boy, I am like white. I'm like super white. And so that was a huge eye opener for me. And I think I also became aware of being American too, as a very salient identity for me during that time, which I was not aware of how American I am also.
Tell me what that means. So again, I think I know what you mean, but I want you to tell me what you mean by I realized I was white and I'm like really white and I'm really American.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm
Tell
like
me what that
super white
means.
and American. Yeah. So for one, for me I think it's changed over time, and there's other experiences too I can talk about. For me, it was really realizing, sort of in some ways, humbling me, right? For one, because I think as an American, particularly a white American with lots and lots of privilege, going to a place like South Africa, not only being directly faced with just abject poverty beyond my comprehension, but also just the racial injustice was so visible for me, for one, particularly at that point in the country, its history, but also for me in terms of my whiteness, just realizing how clueless I was, to be honest with you. I mean, it was really like, wow, I have not had to think about this. It has not affected how I move in space. And I was aware of it every single minute there that I was living there. I remember for like 20 seconds, 20 minutes, I went to Zimbabwe, traveled around Southern Africa at one point and went to Zimbabwe. And I remember shopping at a market. And then during like 20 minutes of that 6 months, I like
then when I realized again, oh yeah, wait a minute, I'm white. Like I had like a 20-minute break where I wasn't thinking about it. And then I was like, whoa, like it was just salient. And I think for me, I realized how clueless I was and how naive I was and how protected I've been, from really looking at structural racism, really looking at race relations and, understanding that my experience is not universal, right? It's like a very white American thing to assume that everybody's having the same experience as me. And it's like, oh hell no, that's not at all happening. Mm-hmm. And I think for me also, realizing that this is so much bigger than me, so much bigger than me, and yet I have a part in it. So I think that's when I say sort of my whiteness, and I sort of was aware of like what it like in that time period of my life, like, whoa, there's so much more happening here that I'm clueless about. And I need to update myself. I need to grow up in some ways around that within my own development. In my career, I've had the chance to work at the VA. And I think working with veterans and particularly around racial trauma and hate crimes that happened, and providing trauma treatment. So, and seeing also the systemic racism within not only the VA system, but in the larger system, like applying for disability benefits, applying for, trying to get my clients an accurate diagnosis, for example, for traumatic brain injury, so that they could apply for, benefits because they could not work. And seeing the bias in the system, seeing the ways that the system is set up that are absolutely racist was a huge eye-opener for me as a therapist working in, a mental health system. And then I would say the sort of pivotal moment for me where I realized I could not just not do something was with my kids. I think having my children, going through a divorce, also realizing that like, this is on me, like if this is my responsibility. And a few years ago, my daughter, I think she was around 4 at the time. She, we were in a play place, and I was like, oh, there's a little girl like kind of the same age as you, why don't you go play with her or whatever? And because she often feels left out because her brothers sometimes exclude her, which is a very common sibling dynamic, right? But, she said she did not want to play with a girl because of her race, because of the girl's race. And I was pissed. I was like, no. That's not how I raised you. And it was a wake up call. And then of course I paused because I was like, oh my God, I don't want to exile like her little exiles that are like picking up on the racism in our culture. But I think for me, that was a big eye opener of just how much white supremacy is in the air, is in the water. And it's like, hey, I spend so much time as a parent trying to be conscious of filling my kid's cup. How am I filling my kid's cup? And then realizing, wait a minute, I didn't put that in there, but it's getting in there whether or not I want it to or not. And so I have to actively fight against it and educate my kids and talk about racism and talk about whiteness over and over with my kids. I think that was the moment for me, particularly as a parent, to be like, okay, I'm not doing enough. I need to do more in my community as well as within myself.
So can you give me some examples of how you talk to your kids about whiteness? I would love to hear that, like how you have those conversations about white privilege with kids.
Yeah. Well, for one, I mean, I think, my kids are almost 7 now. They're like 6.5.
And let's just let the audience know that you have 3 children the same age.
I do. I have triplets. Yes. My triplets.
I heard somebody say one time, like if you have twins, so it's with triplets, like that's 3 babies at the same time.
At the same time. That's right. Yeah. Yes. It's been a wild road with that, but it's super fun. I mean, they're such a fun age, and And they're so open, right? They're so open. And so, so talking about whiteness with my kids, letting them know they're white, where our ancestors came from, mentioning our ancestors, honoring our ancestors, and, helping them understand really why there are different shades of skin tone. So talking about melanin in the skin and that's the reason. And yet there's also racism, and that long ago, white people intentionally made some massive mistakes, right? Intentionally. And so, and we have a lot to do to try to heal that. Yeah. So, I think trying to keep it simple, and like kids get it. They don't need a ton of, it's sort of slowly trying to integrate the reality of the history very slowly in terms of like, yeah, my kids have been learning about, Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln. And it's like, let's talk about that. You know what I mean? That's, perhaps what they're learning in school is not the reality. And I also have to educate myself in reality, because I was also taught the lie, right, of white history. And so, but I think talking about it in a connected way, not at like a shaming way with them, obviously, but a way that they know that they can use privilege to try to help. Also to call out, if they see somebody doing something racist, to what to do about it, in terms of like bullying. We talk about bullying a lot. So yeah. And it's, the white supremacy shows up in a lot of different ways. And because they're at an age where they're mimicking what they're hearing, I also talk about with them other ways it can come up. Like it comes up here with language, living in Dallas, they are exposed to they hear lots of different languages, at a park or whatever. And Spanish, of course, and they're learning Spanish as well in school. And so to make sure they know there's not a hierarchy with language, they might automatically think like, oh, English is better, or somebody can't speak English, then we're better than them, or some bullshit, white supremacy stuff. And so, talking about all of that. So
I love that. I love that, because you're like, that's something that a lot of people, and we might even, parts of me might believe. I'm like, do I have a part that believes that? Probably. That about language, right? That there's some supremacy around language. I think for me, sometimes it's really helpful to hear those examples. And so we're not just talking about it like, yeah, white supremacy, but then like that is such a good example about language. Cause I'm like, oh yeah, I bet I do have a part of that believes that. And then having that type of conversation with my kid. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, absolutely. There's a great book out there by Dr. Jennifer Harvey called Raising White Kids. It's really good. She breaks it down, and she talks about, lots of examples about how, the white supremacy can show up in kids, and all the research that's, been published, particularly in the past few years, about that. Kids are ready to talk about race way earlier than we are as parents, particularly as white parents, where we, because of white privilege, can delay that conversation. So
exactly. I think Duran had said, she talked about, and I think she talked about this openly, about her son, who is, I think, a year or two younger than mine. So probably around your kid's age, maybe a little bit older. And but that he's very aware of his race, and being a Black boy living outside of DC, he's very aware of his race. And I don't know that my son, he's aware of other people's races. But I don't know that he's aware that he's white and what that means, especially because we live in New Hampshire and it's like very white up here.
Yeah. So, there's lots of ways to talk about race with kids. And I think for me as a white parent of white children, not feeding into how I was raised, which was more from a colorblind approach, right, in the 80s, where it's like, oh, we're all the same. Race isn't important, or let's ignore that, or let's treat people color. I don't see color. We're all the human race. And it's like, that's so damaging. And so that disconnects us from really seeing a person. And so trying to teach my kids and leading by example, really more than anything, trying to teach my kids to embody who they are, and also and honor their ancestors, as well as honor other people's ancestors too, right? And their cultural and racial identity.
Do you want to talk about because I think this leads us into that idea of access points to begin working with white socialized parts?
White socialized parts. Yeah, I think for me, at least in my own journey as a white person and working with other white people, particularly around their whiteness, sometimes it can be really hard, like to find that access points to transition to do parts work around it, right? It can be this sort of amorphous, massively huge, overwhelming thing to really look at racism and within ourselves. So it really can take sort of the collective and looking at it more in that personal way with parts. So with white socialized parts, I think for me in my own journey, it's been helpful. I know to think about it developmentally, and for what I mean by that is to be aware that, we all have protectors, particularly as white people. And yes, systemic racism just reinforces us from looking at that, right? Because we don't have to, because of white privilege and systemic racism sort of keeping our place in the hierarchy. So knowing that it's a lot of protectors around this might feel really vulnerable and really a shift in terms of, okay, how can I look at parts of me that want to deny or pretend or look away, and befriend those parts and try to figure out why, asking those parts, what job do they have in my system? I know for me, it's been around, those parts of me have been around more about not wanting to feel accountable, not wanting to touch into the grief. I think the collective grief and the reality of just how devastating this is, with racism and all the harm that is caused through the generations. And so, so for me, developmentally, one thing that's been helpful is the framework of Dr. Janet Helms' white racial identity model. For me, this has been, and I just want to kind of name, this is like super white of me to be like, oh, let's come up with let's look at the model and yay, we have something linear, oh, I like that because it gives me structure. But I will say, it is very helpful. It's helpful for me and it's helpful for my parts because it helps me know, hey, it helps invite in that curiosity of okay, wait a minute. There is a developmental path here. There is a little bit of a roadmap of saying, okay, where am I in the bigger picture? Where do I start? Where are my parts? Because I know for me, I have some parts that I have to continually update and be and befriend and be no, I know you want to believe that that's how the world is, but that's not how the world is. We have to continue to update our parts around that. So for me, I can talk a little bit about the model if that'd be helpful.
That would be great. Yep.
So Dr. Janet Helms, she's a research psychologist and educator. This is really one of the massive contributions in her career was around white racial identity development. And so she published this, I think, originally in 1984, and then really a lot in the 90s, particularly in the mid 90s, 1995. And it's a 6-stage model. And just like any sort of developmental model, being aware that with our parts, it's fluid. Some parts may be kind of older or, at different stages of the model. And then some parts within our system may be, at earlier stages in the model. So the first stage is the context stage. So this is the colorblind place where people are, just like we talked about, oh, we're the human race, racism doesn't exist, or I don't see color. It's really this denial of the reality of racism. So that's sort of the first stage, right? And I know I have parts that can identify with being in that stage, particularly just being socialized as a white person in terms of my own race socialization in that stage. I think the second stage is disintegration. And this is really where a white person becomes more aware of their whiteness and the privilege that it brings. And it also elicits more guilt and shame. Okay. So easy for white people to get kind of stuck. And I have parts that, can get stuck in this stage too, to be like, oh my gosh, this is horrendous. And feeling overwhelmed by, guilt and shame. And that's part of the process, right? Developmentally. And it's like, okay, those parts that feel that way, we can just take a breath and befriend them and get to know them, and know that this is historical. We did not choose this. And yes, we are all here, and we need to kind of look at this and continue the befriending process around parts, feel like, that are in that stage. And then the third stage.
Can I pause you for one second?
Yeah.
I just had an idea. Well, I just had a thought. It's not really an idea. I just had a thought for myself as I thought, okay, if I didn't, this is one of the reasons why I love IFS. If I didn't befriend my guilt and shame, then I'd go back to the first stage and I just go back into denial.
That's
Because
right.
the guilt and because if I moved into does that make sense? So
Yes.
I moved into the second stage, and obviously I would feel so guilty for having these racist thoughts, or having the thought that like English is the better language, or white is the better place to be, or whatever, or thank God I'm white, or whatever horrible thought that I would have, that a part of me would have. And then if the guilt and shame would be too overwhelming, and then I have parts that love numbing and love denial, and that's a happy place. Just let me give me cookies and let me just be in my denial place, and I'll be fine. So so if I didn't befriend that guilt and shame, then I wouldn't be able to move on.
Exactly. Yes. And realizing the legacy burden piece here, right? Some of that guilt and shame is ours, right? I know in my own system, some of that guilt and shame is mine. And over time, that has helped me feel responsible, right? In a way where I can do something about it, in an empowered place, not in a like, oh, I'm a horrible person, I'm going to be a horrible person forever place. So that befriending process is so important. And knowing the legacy burden piece, that we're feeling the historical trauma too, right? And being in the role of the perpetrator, right? On the perpetrator end of things.
Right, definitely. And that idea of the legacy burden, like two things that come up for me is the intensity of that, because it's a legacy burden. So I think it has this intensity. So it's not just mine. There's a legacy there. And as you say that, I'm just, all of a sudden I just started remembering things I remember, like my dad grew up in Baltimore City. And so there's lots of issues with race in Baltimore. I mean, obviously even still, and just remember growing up and having him say stuff. And then my grandfather, like working and living in DC, and the stuff that he would say. So yeah, I just sort of thinking that. So there's that sort of, right, there's the intensity. And then also there's this, maybe this is going to sound really weird, but maybe there's almost like more of a relaxing is not the right word, but permission to be like, okay, it's not just me. It's what I've been taught, the culture that I've been in, the family dynamics that I've been in. So then that actually helps the befriending process.
Absolutely. I know for me, it has. It can invite in more space, right? It's like, hey, wait a minute. This is not, yes, there is an aspect that is mine, that I own. And yet there's lots of layers here, right? And that the legacy burden piece of like, wait a minute, some of this was handed to these parts from not having been repaired or dealt with or faced or, worked on before.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you for letting me sort of like talk through that. I was like, I'm having a feeling. I've got to talk through it.
Yeah. I love that your parts are close by. So that's great. Yeah. So with that disintegration stage where kind of the guilt and shame really can start to come up, then the stage 3 is reintegration. And this actually is, even though it's considered to be a step forward in the model, from an outside perspective, it can be a step back. This is where a lot of white fragility parts show up, because it's like there's cognitive dissonance happening here. It's like, wait a minute, okay, I am white, I do have privilege, but then it's like the parts that want to come in and explain why, or think they know the answer to why I have privilege, in not an accurate way, step in, right, to kind of help explain it. So this is where they feel like, oh, well, maybe I did something, this is really about me. In some way I deserve to have these privileges, or I am superior. It's where a lot of white superiority and white fragility parts, which are like rampant, and I have white fragility parts too, right? I mean, yes. So this can look like where you're actually going backwards, but actually you're going forwards in the model, which is a little confusing, but it's like, wait, at least with those white fragility parts showing up, it's like, whoop, that's a part. You know what I mean?
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
like if I have a part show up and be like, oh, I want to like super intellectualize this, or if I want to like try to throw different facts at something, or if I want to feel defensive or pretend or like separate myself from it or distance myself and say, that's not me. It's like, those are all parts highly likely in that reintegration stage.
I love that. And then the thing that is interesting about that is you might not realize that you're in a part, right? You might, yeah.
It's super easy to get blended with parts around this. And it can be, and again, so it's like kindness and softness to all of our own race socialization, right? It kind of goes back to that piece where it's like, okay, how can we invite in more self-energy here? We can totally do this as white people. It's like, we can call in like some self-energy and be like, we can move through this. This is about building some stamina here with this process, and community. This is where community is very, very helpful. So we can call in that sort of collective self energy, whether that be white affinity groups, whether that be in community with, people of color, allies in our journey, our accountability buddies, whatever it may be. But this is where the collective self can be really helpful.
I love that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, so stage 4 is more that pseudo independence. This is a lot of times is where white people are, they're more getting it. They're more like, okay, wait a minute. No, systemic racism is real. And I do have white privilege as a white person. And this is a lot of times a very intellectual process for white people. It can feel more like disembodied, if you will, where it's like the dots are clicking, but then it's sort of like, okay, now what do I do about it? Like where, I think a lot of white people felt some of this after the murder of George Floyd, where it's like, whoa, 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 like, okay, I cannot deny this. This is so real in my face. And yet, what do I do about it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then a part of me goes back to that first stage, right? It's so overwhelming and so horrifying.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then I'm embarrassed that I'm like, this isn't new. Yeah. And then I'm like, just give me cookies.
Yes, exactly. Right. So we have parts that may want to, I know for me, like may want to run and hide. And sort of stay in like a safe bubble of surrounding myself with only white people and pretending that everything's okay. But then it's like, wait a minute, where the cost of that is like, we're really kind of disconnected, right? From ourselves, from other people. Like,
yeah.
But
then I also think that there could probably be, and I'm like, people are going to get mad at me for saying this, but I feel like there's also going to be parts that could also be then like hyper, like I'm going to do something, and that could feel extreme and a lot of efforting and a lot of like intensity of like, I'm going to now do something. And that sounds good. And you might think you're in self energy when you do that. And you could be, but it also could be like, I'm going to fix this, right? Like
totally. Yes. It can show up as like white saviorism or.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, totally. Oh my gosh, for sure. And like some self-righteousness stuff.
Yes.
Maybe self-like parts and which can be, I mean, and to name that, like, I think there's part of white culture is this sense of like, there is this sort of sense of urgency. I think that's part of white culture to begin with. And I know for me in my own system, I really have to watch that because and really question, okay, what parts are exactly stepping forward here in this process and that want to do something? Where is that to relinquish some sense of guilt, or is that, is that to soothe my own system, or is that really in service,
Well, and then in one of these other podcasts I did, or maybe it was from Duran, then it sort of turns that into, again, about me, right? Like I'm doing
Exactly.
that, and then it's about me and me feeling good about my whiteness, and like, yeah. And so I can easily do that. And then, yeah. And so maybe that's
Yeah.
also sort of to recognize that and check inside about that, what that's feeling like. If it does feel like it's a bit about you, then it's okay. Then that's a part, and that's okay. But
Exactly.
just
It is a
sort of
part. Yeah.
getting curious about that.
Totally. And I know for me, yes, I know for me, I've noticed I've sort of it's familiar enough to me now where it's like, ooh, that's definitely a part because it shows up in my nervous system in a certain way where it's like, feels like I can't slow down and like take a breath. And it's like, I have to do something, do. And white culture is so about action oriented, like, oh, if I do something, then it's better. And, and it's just like, whoa, wait a minute. This is so much bigger than any one person. And doing this in community is really what can be reparative and help put pressure on changing systemic things anyway, which is what needs to happen. And so, so kind of pausing and being curious about those parts that might have an agenda, really. And it might be self-protective from this sense of self-soothing or self-centering, like you're saying. So after this pseudo-independent stage, there's two more stages. There's the immersion stage. And this is where white people begin to really view themselves more from a white identity from a standpoint of not being plagued by those exiles or with legacy burdens too around shame and guilt. It's more like, okay, wait a minute, I can do something. I can use my privilege in a positive way to shift things. And I don't need to look to people of color to soothe me to do that or in that process. This is more like, no, this is about me and me taking responsibility as a white person and, feeling the accountability and not being, get stuck in it in terms of being overwhelmed by, wait a minute, I benefit from systemic racism, and being able to say that and saying, yeah, and what can I do about that? I do benefit from it. And so having more, I think, self-energy around that in terms of activism that's like we talked about, perhaps not coming from that, oh wait, I'm just doing this to soothe my own guilt, but more from a positive standpoint of let's build community, let's have discussion around this. What can we do? And what can I do as a white person where I'm not viewing myself as like an evil person, but I actually can do something because I can,
Yeah. Or that polarization too, right? I view myself as evil and to get lost in that shame and guilt, or I view myself as self-righteous and the white savior. And yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then I'm a good white person, know, and that's.
And I feel like, so I'm from Maryland. I live in New Orleans, and then I've lived up here in New Hampshire for like 10 plus years. And I feel like regionally, there's a lot of that up in New England. I'm like, I wonder what you would think if you lived in the South and you had to deal with these things a little more I don't know. So I guess I just want to say that. And I'm a little bit cringy as I say that, but I'm like, because when you don't realize it, when you live in a region, you really do not realize how you're affected by that region.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Oh gosh. And that's also part of the race socialization, right? Because I do think our country is still healing from the Civil War. I mean, my goodness. We can see regional differences, right, in race socialization and among white people too, right? And I mean, here in Dallas, Texas, it's, I think it's more visible here for me as a white person, the racism, but also that there's a lot of activism happening here also. So it's like yes, there's a lot of venom, but there's also some movement towards an antidote or an anti-venom, energy really building around activism here locally, which is exciting.
That's awesome. Yeah.
And I'll just mention the last stage, which is autonomy, which, this is where really a person, actively starts walking the talk, a white person, in terms of actively pursuing social justice stuff, not from a place of like, oh, I want to get approval from my people, my friends that are people of color. I want to be seen as a good white person, but just because, really embodying it and in their own white identity, So yeah.
I love that. That was great. That was really
Yeah.
good. Yeah, I think about that like self energy wise, right? Like part of like I want my parts to relax and befriend and want to be in self energy so that I can feel it, but also and experience it and live a life in self energy. I don't know if that even if that's right way to say that.
Yeah.
But then it's also about how that affects my family and then how that affects my
Mm-hmm.
town and my community and the people I'm around. So I think it's the same kind of thing as yes, we're doing it for working on our own parts. And then there is this beautiful, like natural outpouring and change of that.
Yes, 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 yes. And that the community and the ripple effect, right? Of you doing your own work.
Yeah,
And
right.
I know for me, I mean, just again, going back like being a parent, it's like I want my kids to not get stuck in guilt and shame, to know that yeah, they are part of this larger system and that they're coming into the world with some privilege already. That doesn't mean they need to feel bad about themselves. It's more like, okay, what does that mean for them in the world? You know?
Yeah, I
So
love that. I love that.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think I have some trailheads that I think would be helpful. And then, I mean, I'm happy to share too any process. I mean, I have like my own little parts map here. Anything around like, because I think for me, again, that developmental piece has been so helpful in
Yeah.
my own self-introspection. So
Perfect. I would love that. I mean, I think people like vulnerability and people like
mm,
personal sharing, and then we can relate to
yeah.
that. So, is there something about your trailheads or your own personal map that you want to share?
Yeah, sure. So I'll share a little bit. I'm looking at my own parts map that I've been kind of putting together around this, and I've been working on this in my own therapy as well as just in my own communities of support around this. But I mean, I have a part that wants to stay separate from this. You know, wants to stay separate from my identity as a white person and what that means as in terms of racism. And I befriending that part is like 1 to 2 years old. That part is so young. And I think for me, like the developmental piece is so important in terms of asking my parts around this how old they are, because most of my protectors that come up around with my own white fragility as well as my own parts that want to deny or look away are all like less than 5 years old. Like they're all younger than 5.
Wow.
And that helps me in my own work with just befriending them and being like, oh wow, these are my little ones.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And yeah, that's great. That's great.
Yeah. And then realizing with these parts that, I mean, part of this also gets reinforced with legacy burdens and systemic racism that, just keeps white privilege and whiteness in place without self-examination. But what I've realized is a lot of my own parts have really protected me against my own accountability, and ultimately a lot of grief, a lot of grief, a lot of sadness, a lot of grief about the reality with systemic racism, with racism here in the United States in particular. It's activated rage parts. It's activated, just lots of exiles that are holding grief energy. And some of that, again, some of that is mine, and some of that is collective. Some of that is more legacy burden and like collective grief. Yeah.
That makes so much sense, right? That it would be these little young parts, and then there would be this grief that is so heavy, and then
Mhm.
you'd have these other parts that want to take you out of that, or deny that, or fix it, or intellectualize it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I feel like being able to stay with that, stay with the parts that are feeling that grief helps me just not helps me try to stay in self energy. And I think too, I mean, as I talk about my parts, I don't want to, give anybody the impression it's like, oh, okay, so then I like help those exiles and we're all good to go. You know what I mean? It's not like that, right? It's like, I'm still white regardless. Like I'm white even as I do my parts work, I am white. I will always be white as I move through the world.
Yeah.
For me, it's been helpful so it's not, after the unburdening or whatever of an exile, it's not like all good to go, we're all fixed now, but it's more like this continual update and befriending of my parts that come up around race and racism as a white person. And because it's like, and again, updating, I mean, continually updating, like, no, that's not how the world is. Like what you were taught is wrong and, not true. So that's just a little bit about my process around that.
That's great. Thank you for
Yeah.
sharing that.
Yeah.
Is there anything about trailheads that you want to offer or suggest for the listeners?
I do. So a couple of trailheads that have helped me personally is what keeps me disconnected from myself around race, because looking at, in terms of doing parts work, it's like, what's keeping me disconnected from this, and what's keeping me connected to it as well. I know for me, like I said, I've been sitting with parts that want to say, oh, that's not me, or somehow separate myself from my white identity. And it's like, being curious about, okay, any part that says, oh, well, that doesn't affect me, or that, that's not me, or I'm separate from this, or something like that. It's like, those are all parts. I think for me also, what parts do I notice coming up in my work with BIPOC clients, in terms of my work that I need, that I continue to do as a white therapist, providing trauma treatment, and then eventually, what parts come up in considering myself as a white person benefiting from systemic racism, and it's like, with lots of softness and kindness towards ourselves, knowing that we are, and that's by no means to take away any accountability in it, but it's more just staying present with it, not giving up on it, staying present, staying connected to yourself around this. So ultimately, it's really about connection. This is relational, not only with ourselves and our parts, but then in community with people, including, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So connection, what's helping the connection. And if there's any parts that are getting in the way of connecting to yourself around this. With this, I think it's so important to view this in terms of, again, I'm talking about working with white people here, to call in, right? To come from a standpoint of calling in rather than calling out, because we are so self-protective with our white parts. And so when I say calling in, it's like, just, again, going back to that connection piece, how can we stay connected to this? How can we stay connected to ourselves? Let's call in each other. Let's come together in community around this. Because this is us, and this is also collective. This is collective. This is ancestral. This is historic. This is present, and we can do something about it. So it's coming at it more from this, like, we can do this, y'all. Like, let's all come together. We can do this. In terms of looking at our parts.
I love it. I love calling in. I've not heard of that before.
Yeah, calling in versus calling out. Yeah, there's some articles out there around it in terms of just, and I'm a Brene Brown fan too, so it's like, she talks about shame is just going to keep us in inaction around this, particularly as a white person. And it's so true. It's so true, right? Those parts will just, they'll take over our system and overwhelm us, and we'll get blended, and we'll be like, I can't do this anymore, right? And those parts are likely really young. And so it's like, oh, we can invite in our self-energy and be like, you know what? I'm going to take your hand. We're doing this together. And also with other people too. We can do this together in community and come together to really look at this and try to, begin to unpack it, particularly as a white person, in the name of all the things that need to be done around this.
Right. That's great. So the last question I ask is, if you weren't doing what you're doing for the world and you had to do something different, I'm going to start asking this question this way. You had to do something different than you're already doing. What would you do instead?
Oh my gosh, this is such a juicy question. Okay. Because I'm like a person that has, like, multiple pots cooking at the same time kind of thing. It's like, So it's hard to pick just one thing.
You don't have to pick one thing. You can pick several.
Good.
Yeah, you can pick lots.
Good.
Yeah.
I'm gonna
you just can't pick the thing that you're doing right now.
Okay. So if I'm not doing, I would, so there's some, I would want to get involved more in the truth and reconciliation efforts in this country. I know there's efforts here being made in Dallas, Texas to work on truth and reconciliation around racism. So I would want to get involved in that, those efforts for reparative justice, including reparations, including cultural healing, ritual community in witnessing truth telling, so that's what I would want to get involved in. And then I also would want to get a camper and take my kids, I think, around the US and get them in nature more, and Canada, and just get outside more with them. And I have, one of my sons loves rocks and bugs, and it's like, oh, let's go look at the rocks and the bugs. And my daughter loves to, play in water and walk in rivers and play with stones and rivers. And, I have a son like super into science, my other son's super into science. So I would just want to feed those interests, and get outside more, I think, in nature. So yeah, that's what I would do. And then the other thing I would do is I would write, would want to write in community. That would be super fun. So
I love it. And I feel like all three of those things can work together.
Yeah. Yes, they probably could.
They could. Well, this was great. Is there anything else you want to say, or?
Thank you. I just appreciate the opportunity. Honestly, I can't think of anything. I think I'm wanting this to be hopeful. I feel like it's really easy, particularly when we're talking about whiteness and white people, for white people to get shut down in their own systems because they may not have the racial stamina to really look at this issue. And it's like, we can do this. We can totally do this. This is doable. We have to. We have to. This is a must, but it's at the same time with me saying we have to, it's like an invitation. We can do it.
Yeah. We can do it with self there, right? So if we're wanting our little ones to do it, they can't do it. Right. They're under they can't do it. It's too heavy and too much for them. And it's overwhelming and scary. And so, they can't do it. And but self can. With self in the lead, then we can.
Yes, we can. Totally.
Thanks for hanging out today. If you liked this episode, make sure you subscribe. And if you really like this episode, share it with a friend and leave a review. You can follow me on Instagram at IFS Tammy and join our community on Facebook at the One Inside Podcast. Talk to you next time.